Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. On today's show, we go through the latest Mets news, including Ronny Mauricio's torn ACL, the trickle effect of Shohei Ohtani signing with the Dodgers and how that'll impact the rest of free agency, and a huge week in the Yamamoto sweepstakes. As always, we close out the show answering your mailbag questions. So subscribe to the Mets Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch every episode on SNY's YouTube or wherever you get your podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And here's your reminder to subscribe to our show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify. You can watch all our episodes on SNY's YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcast. I'm your host, Connor Rogers, joined as always by my co-host, Joe DeMayo. And Joe, these are the pods that it's just there's no way around it. It's a stinky start to the show, right? It's just a bummer. A young player like Ronny Mauricio playing fall ball. He tears his ACL. He had been hitting in the fall league. He had obviously finished very strongly with the Mets when he got called up last year. He had strung together quite a few hitting streaks. We saw some power. We saw some speed. We saw the energy. And this was a player that going into spring training, it appears the door was wide open for him to go out there and earn an everyday playing job. And with the torn ACL, the picture of the Mets competition on the diamond and throughout a lot of various areas now looks a lot different. So just what was your initial thoughts, short term or little picture here, just right on Ronny Mauricio, but then the big picture that the Mets got to put out a major league team in a couple months?
I mean, obviously you feel bad for Ronny Mauricio. Young player that was really emerging in a big way. And like you said, Connor, he was going to be a part of a competition for third base likely in spring training. Unfortunately, a freak kind of thing on the base paths, torn ACL. You have to imagine that wipes out all of his season, or certainly almost all of the season. So you have to operate under the idea that you're not going to have Ronny Mauricio this year. What that means, and this may not be what Met fans want to hear, this is just a huge opportunity for Brett Baty. I don't think the Mets pivot should be, all right, Ronny Mauricio's gone, who, by the way, was going to be competing for a third base job. That didn't mean he was the favorite or he had a leg up on Baty. Baty could have outright won the job from him. So I think what the Mets need to do is give Brett Baty an opportunity to be the third baseman, and maybe the designated hitter spot. We've talked about the JD Martinez kind of pure DH types. We've talked about Jorge Soler, who is a DH, maybe outfielder. Does this push them more in the direction of a Justin Turner, who is a DH that is also capable of playing some third base in a pinch? We know that David Stearns previously, when he was with Milwaukee, he had interest on more than one occasion of bringing Justin Turner to Milwaukee. So I think this is a player that David Stearns has long eyed, and it would be kind of a maybe Cinderella comeback story of how everything fell apart with Justin Turner and the Mets. He goes on, has a fantastic career with the Dodgers and the Red Sox, and have him come full circle back to Queens as a DH/insurance policy at third base. I think that should be the plan. I don't want to think about Matt Chapman or signing a different third baseman. Where the Mets are organizationally, they need to give Brett Baty a legitimate opportunity here. And if he falls on his face and it doesn't work out, then you know Brett Baty is not your future at third base, and you adjust accordingly.
I'm with you, but I am also going to emphasize the need for insurance, kind of like you said. And there are all kinds of various forms of insurance. I'm with you that you don't go out and pay Matt Chapman, right? Or do you need to go trade for Bregman or just something that feels, yes, it would be an upgrade, but reactionary in terms of how it impacts the long term. Brett Baty needs to get a real shot, and he has not performed when given the shot. There's no way around that. Nobody's saying that it's been unfair to Brett Baty. He needs to take this and run with it. But the reality is, if the first 3 months of the season look a lot like last year, then there needs to be somebody on this roster that can also play third base while contributing offensively. And I really like that you bring up Justin Turner, because that feels like the one that makes the most sense to me. He's a guy that could still hit. There is obviously the background story that you would like to see his chapter with the Mets end on a better note than the last one did. But besides the emotions of it, he is a guy that could also play third base. And while you're giving Beatty that shot, like you highlighted, Joe, he has a lot of value to the team because the Mets do not have a proven DH. And it goes back to the point of the Mets were going into this spring, we think, and there's a lot of offseason left, with guys like Vientos and Mauricio and Beatty. And I don't include Alvarez in that group because I think it's pretty clear Alvarez is the future everyday catcher as much as catchers play, while the other guys, in my opinion, haven't proven enough on a long stretch. But Mauricio had the best flashes over the time he was here. And Mauricio was the guy that in our, that gut feeling and, the overall vibe of it was that he's a guy he's going to run away with some kind of role on the team. And now it gets a little thinner and it is a big question mark. And I just don't think you want to find yourself in a place, Joe, that Beatty has a slow start offensively. He's not a plus defender. We don't even know if he's an average defender. And then Joey Wendell, a guy that played 38 games at third base in 2022, is a guy that needs to be out there in an everyday role when his purpose on this team is what we've seen from Guillorme in the past as a utility guy. And that's the fear as a Mets fan, is that if you just do absolutely nothing, is that you can get to June and it could be a bigger deal than we even imagine, because say they get Yamamoto and they have Senga and Quintana has a good season and the Mets are 3 games back from the wild card, but you have no solutions at third base. Like that's the thinking ahead that I'm trying to do here. And it sounds like you've done a lot of that as well. And you hate to jump so far away from Mauricio, but the reality is David Stearns has work to do now to give this team a shot at that position, whether it's Beatty or whether it's someone else. And then when you look at Mauricio with an ACL, you figure 6 to 7 months of rehab. I mean, he's probably going to get back to Syracuse, I would think, middle of end of August. He probably needs a lot of time to really get back to being an everyday athlete. And we don't know if we're going to see him in a Mets uniform this year, but we hope we ultimately do.
Yeah, of course we're going to hope, but it also depends when does he get the surgery. As you know, covering football where ACLs are abundant, it depends on swelling going down for when they do the surgery. I mean, I'm a Cowboys fan. I remember when Michael Gallup tore his ACL, he didn't get the surgery for like 7 weeks, I think, after the injury. So it could be a while until the surgery. Then, of course, the long rehab. It is important for them to protect themselves from a depth standpoint. It's just tough to build a roster where you sign like a better version of Joey Wendell that's not quite a DH. Tough to carry 2 kind of backup infielders as insurance, which is where I think Justin Turner makes all the sense in the world. And I would hope that would be something the Mets look into here over the coming weeks as the DH market kind of settles itself and we figure out who's going where.
Right. And when you look at Turner, he's somebody that, he'll have options because he's still an effective offensive player. But we've often said this on this show. It's been kind of a theme of our off seasons. The Mets are a team that when it comes to playing in the 1-year market, and I think Justin Turner at age 39, happy belated to Turner, he turned 39 at the end of this November. He's probably playing on 1-year deals the rest of his days as a big leaguer. And the Mets, with the cash that they have, and cash is different than whether it's cap space in leagues. Obviously, MLB doesn't have a cap, but they have a tax threshold that is effectively in some ways a cap. The Mets, Joe, with Cohen have a ton of cash that in a 1-year market, they should be able to beat any team. That's never really the question with the Mets. And we saw them already go do this year. They gave Severino, a deal that was in excess of $10 million a year. So it's realistic to say Turner could be back here. I think Turner's frustrations were with people that don't exist in this organization anymore. So if you're talking about bridges burned or hard feelings, people at, professions of all levels can put that behind them when it's, the only thing that's the same is the colors of the uniform and the name of the team and where they play. So we'll keep an eye on the Justin Turner situation. I know people at the mailbag, and we have a lot of mailbag questions today, we're bringing up Turner's name. I think it makes a ton of sense. And a fallout of free agency, Joe, we've been waiting for this because this offseason really couldn't get out of the gate until Shohei Ohtani made a decision. And yes, we've seen some 1-year deals trickle in. We've seen some moves. But as far as the big moves, Ohtani needed to sign, and then it was going to kind of become, okay, what does this open the door for to where? Ohtani gets the deal with the Dodgers. Everyone's heard by now. It's a 10-year, $700 million deal. Basically $68 million a year will be deferred. He's making $2 million a year. It's unheard of. We'll get to more of the actual specifics of the deal during the mailbag. But as far as it goes of what Ohtani's signing does, Joe, how fast do you expect the pace of this market to actually pick up before Christmas now?
I think you're going to see a flurry of moves over the next week and a half, because once you kind of get to right around Christmas, front offices, they don't shut down, but between Christmas and New Year's, there's very limited activity. And there already has been limited activity this offseason to begin with. So I believe over the next, call it 10 days or so, there should be a flurry of moves in the sport. Ohtani obviously moves the needle for other designated hitters to potentially find opportunities, because I think a lot of, like JD Martinez, for example, we mentioned him earlier in the show. He was probably sitting there saying, if Ohtani goes to Toronto, I probably have a job to go back to the Dodgers. Well, now Ohtani went to the Dodgers, so now JD Martinez needs to find obviously a different home to play. So I do think it moves the market. And like you said, we'll get into the details of the contract in the mailbag. I'm sure we have some very specific questions about that, but it's going to have a interesting impact on what the Dodgers do from here, which by proxy has an impact on what the Mets do from here.
Right, of course. And we'll get to Yamamoto in just a second, because I think that's on everybody's mind. But I'll sneak in a mailbag question right now, Joe, just to kind of stay on topic here, because everybody's wondering it. And this is from Sleeping Forest. Does the league need to implement some sort of limitations on contract deferrals, or is the Ohtani contract some weird albatross? So, I mean, the reality is the language of the CBA, there is no limitation on the money you can or can't defer. So you can be mad at baseball for this. You could be mad that Ohtani would agree to something like this. And it's very odd that the players union in a way would allow this, because deferrals are often not preferred by players. But the reality is the Dodgers used a loophole in the CBA to their advantage where, and Joe, correct me if I'm wrong here, the tax threshold of this, the collective bargaining, like the tax of this will effectively count for $46 million a year when you're adding up to the luxury tax. And listeners of this show know that the Cohen tax and penalties of draft picks and everything that comes along with that. So the Dodgers were able to manipulate this where, I'm not saying Ohtani's on a bargain for them. I mean, he's getting $700 million and he is counting $46 million against their luxury tax, obviously threshold each season. But he did do them a big favor in that it lowered the number. They can be players for big time free agents. They will go after Yamamoto, as we'll see in the next coming days. And I think that the answer here, Joe, is the league probably needs to implement a limitation on this, because you could say, well, anybody could go do it. But the problem is, and it's funny as a Mets fan, it really only benefits the mega power teams, because they're the ones that can, and I see you smiling and nodding. I always like when Joe agrees with a baseball take of mine. They're the ones that can offer this ridiculous amount of money, where the smaller market team, they're not even calling Ohtani. So they really have no way to maximize this loophole while the bigger teams do. And I think that's why the reaction around baseball was not a good one when the details of this contract leaked.
I think it's exactly what you said. It's obviously a benefit to big market teams. I believe they probably should put some semblance of limitation to what you can do. Like it literally says verbatim, like there's no limit to what you can do. So the Dodgers didn't really loophole. The Dodgers just read the rules, and they were very fortunate that Shohei Ohtani called and told them that's what he wanted to do.
Right.
Because I'll tell you this, spoiler alert, teams would love to defer every single contract if they could.
Right.
Because money today is worth more than money tomorrow. That's the way the world works. And like you said, Connor, it is obviously a significant difference in what his CBT tax number is. If he obviously signed a straight 10-year, $700 million deal, that's $70 million against the cap. the way I'm not going to pretend to be an accountant. I don't know about all those interest rates and all this stuff that there's people that do math that figure that out for me. But like you said, it's going to count $46 million for the Dodgers, which ultimately is, a $24 million savings from the total contract. And what's funny is if you think about it from a present day standpoint, MLB's CBT basically looks at Ohtani as signing a 10-year, $460 million deal. If I told you Ohtani signed a 10-year, $460 million deal a week ago, you would have been like, oh, that's about right, because we figured it was like 500, maybe a little over. Like, oh, he took a little less money to go to the Dodgers. And ultimately, Ohtani is still the highest tax number in the sport. So it's not as if the Dodgers are getting him for $2 million a year on the tax, because when I think of financials within baseball, I don't really care how the billionaires are dishing out the physical cash. They could backload it, front load it, whatever the case may be. Cash, how they disperse the cash doesn't mean anything to me. It's all about how it affects on the competitive balance tax. So it'll be interesting to see what the next CBA brings, because I'm sure there are some people not happy about this, but I really don't think it's quite as blasphemous and like hurting the sport as people want to paint it to be. I think it's just the way of doing business. I mean, you look back at the Nationals, they were a big deferral team. They deferred 50% of Max Scherzer's over $200 million contract. They deferred 40% of Steven Strasburg's over $200 million contract. Now that's not like whatever 90-something percent, but it's still like significant deferrals. And Ohtani is just a unique guy that was unique, and his whole free agency was unique. Color me not shocked that his contract ended up being the most unique contract ever either.
Right. There's nothing really surprising anymore with Ohtani. I think we all felt the Dodgers would be the destination, but how he got there was the biggest question in all of this. And boy, was it a drama-filled free agency when you look at some of the stories that have come out of this. But
tracking planes, I remember that. That's like a college football thing.
Yeah, it is a college football thing.
Where's Jimbo Fisher going?
Right, except it's a little bit more difficult when you're tracking planes to major cities in North America. So, anyways, I think the bigger reason why we're talking Ohtani on this show, Joe, is that now I think the conversation has changed a little bit. At least to me, the combo for so long was if the Dodgers get Ohtani, that will take them out of Yamamoto. And they're a big player for Yamamoto. So that would be, you would think in theory, good for the Mets. And it would ultimately come down to the Mets and the Yankees as the front runner. We know he's met with the Giants, who Joe and I have been saying this for, I think, 3 months now. Someone someday will take the Giants' money. We don't know who it's going to be, but the Giants have thrown out their mammoth offers, whether it be to Aaron Judge, Carlos Correa. Then they will make Yamamoto a massive offer. So never discount the Giants. Mark Feinsand actually has said today that he will meet with the Red Sox in the coming days. And then there are two or three more teams, including the Blue Jays, who will also likely meet with him. So Yamamoto's a busy man. We know the Blue Jays are big players right now. We read everything about the investment from a marketing standpoint they thought Ohtani was, and maybe there's some of that thought with Yamamoto. Joe and I seem to be believers that Steve Cohen will not be outbid in all of this, but this is much more beyond just the top dollar. So I think right now, Joe, what's scary is with the structuring of the Ohtani deal is that the Dodgers are not out of this as far as we know. And if you look at the Dodgers, the way we talk about the Dodgers is, oh, the Dodgers, like powerhouse. Now they got Ohtani. They have Betts and Freeman. And the Dodgers are awesome. The Dodgers quietly really have a lot of questions around their starting rotation right now. And I mean deep, significant questions as a contender. So I think they're right in this again now too, Joe. And it's going to be one of those things where did this market and bidding go to a place that we couldn't have seen coming because the demand is so insanely high that at the end of the day, I'm not saying he's going to take it, but Yamamoto has a $330 million offer on the table from somebody, and it could be the Mets, because that's what I'm starting to think.
It is going up and up with every report and every day, and maybe we're like bidding him up. maybe we're bidding him up publicly. That's a possibility. And maybe he doesn't actually go to quite the levels, because Jerry Blevins said it on this show, during the winter meetings. He thinks he's going to exceed Cole's contract. It wouldn't shock me if that were the case. It wouldn't shock me if he signed for $295 million. It's going to be either way a significant investment. And what I have found, because I talked to plenty of Met fan friends and all over Twitter/X, obviously, we have become very much prisoners of the moment when it comes to the offseason in general and Yamamoto specifically. How high was Mets Twitter when they found out Steve Cohen and David Stearns flew to Japan? They're just like, they're doing everything they can. Yamamoto, it's Yamamoto to the Mets time. And then he meets with the Yankees, and now it's, he had a great meeting with the Yankees. That's not good for the Mets. And Ohtani, his contract, that means he's clearly going to the Dodgers. I'll be honest, I think it does help the Dodgers to save $25 million a year, obviously, on the Ohtani contract if they want to pursue Yamamoto. And perhaps they end up with him. But when you mentioned their pitching problems, Connor, those pitching problems aren't just solved by signing Yamamoto. They have Walker Buehler coming off a second Tommy John. And then when you go beyond that, it's just all the young guys. It's Bobby Miller. It's Emmett Sheehan. It's Ryan Pepio. It's a guy like Ryan Yarbrough is penciled into a rotation. So the Dodgers, much like the Yankees in a way, need multiple starting pitchers. And they maybe could use an ace more than the Yankees can. So that could aid their aggressiveness. But I'll always say this too. If money is the deciding factor in a free agent that Steve Cohen wants, Steve Cohen is going to be the high bidder. Is that enough? Your guess is as good as mine. The listener's guess is as good as mine, because you can tell me he was a Dodger fan growing up. You could tell me he likes the number 18 and pinstripes. You could, all these ancillary things. He's friends with Masataka Yoshida in Boston. All these things you could tell me. Almost all the time, money wins and everything else is secondary. Yamamoto maybe will be different, but I also have said this on this show to kind of close my thoughts. When a player from Japan is posted, it's not a requirement, but they get a nudge from their Japanese club to please take the highest or close to the highest offer. Don't cost them a bunch of money. Like if the Mets offer $330 million, like you said, and the Dodgers offer $290, that's going to be costing Oryx quite a bit of money that they would like to have. And they certainly were under no requirement to post him. So I still think I lean highest bidder gets Yamamoto. And I'll tell you this, the Mets better make sure they're the high bidder. That's their job right now, is to make sure they are the high bidder. As long as Yamamoto shows any interest in them and you get the vibe that he would consider, you better make sure you're the high offer and he has to turn down your money to go somewhere else.
And as we're sitting here recording this, it sounds like another arm comes off the table as Seth Lugo is finalizing a deal with the Royals. That is also per Mark Feinsand and Ann Rogers, who covers the Royals for MLB.com. So I know there's been
3 years, $45 million. So good for Seth Lugo.
Good for Seth. That's a nice deal and odd from the Royals.
Seth Lugo has been had been begging the Mets to let him be a starter for years. And they're just like, nope, you're better in the bullpen. He gets the free agency and he went and showed out in a good way for San Diego in 26 starts last year. And good for him. He's cashed in on a $45 million deal. So really,
and what do the Mets need now? Starting pitching.
What do you mean? Oh, no. You don't need pitching.
So
Severino.
That's how it goes sometimes. That's just how it'll be. But getting back to Yamamoto, Joe, because you closed out your point before I interrupted you with that breaking news, that the Mets need to be the high bidder here. And I think you and I, hopefully, with our fine audience, have developed a bit of a reputation for trying to be calculated. We don't really get on here and go, well, Steve Cohen is the richest man in sports. Why isn't Ohtani a Met? Or we look at everything and, try to be a little pragmatic and understand the risk associated with certain moves, and that while in a way money can seem endless for Steve Cohen and all of that is great, there are still tax thresholds in this league, and there are still penalties, and there are still things financially that don't equate to good business and good practices and sustainable winning. Yamamoto is where I kind of, sounds like you agree as well, go off the tracks here and kind of break the general practice of being pragmatic and being so, risk averse, because I don't see the pivot here, right? With Ohtani, I always told myself I'd rather probably go after Juan Soto in free agency in 2024. Honestly, and that's not something I said before the Mets were even not considered in on Ohtani. It's just something you and I talked about. It always made more sense for the Mets. But when you look at Yamamoto, there's no, well, if they don't do this with Yamamoto, they can do this in the next 400 days. There's not that move to me. It's, yeah, if they don't get Yamamoto, I'll be happy if they go get Jordan Montgomery and they do fill out this rotation and they are competitive. But there's not a 25-year-old projected ace with almost, there's some hysteria with Yamamoto. He's from Japan. He hasn't pitched in the big leagues yet. He's got the yo-yo curve. He's, obviously a very intense competitor, very successful overseas. There's so much about him, and he's 25 years old. He could be a mainstay of your rotation for over the next half decade. There's no plan B here, Joe, and that's why I look at it and go, if it comes out in the next 9 days, the Mets are signing Yoshinobu Yamamoto to a 8-year, $350 million contract, I don't care at all. And I usually
$330 million deferred.
What? Yeah. Yeah. Take the Dodgers playbook. Sure. I don't care. I think Yamamoto at 25, though, wants his money. And he wants it now. This is one for me where it's not being irrational, but I just think this is a time where Steve Cohen should act like Steve Cohen in this instance, to put it in very simple terms.
Andrew Friedman of the Dodgers said it best. I'm paraphrasing, but basically, if you're pragmatic about every single free agent, you're going to finish third on every single free agent. You have to pick your spots and when you go above and beyond. And if you have listened to this show over the last couple of years, you realize Connor and I, very pragmatic, very willing to see the alternative options. I wanted to bring up one thing about Yamamoto before we move on from him. A great article in The Athletic by Eno Saris, who does a fantastic job covering pitching and baseball for The Athletic. He wrote up, based on data that he got from the World Baseball Classic, which is obviously a small sample size, using a Rawlings baseball that is not the pre-tack ball that they have in Japan, and compared the data on Yamamoto's pitches to big league pitchers. And what it ultimately came out to was he thought he would have a top 20 four-seam fastball in the sport, the best splitter in the sport, and the Mets have Senga with the forkball, which is a little different, but he'll have the best splitter in the sport. He'll have an elite curveball. He'll have a slightly below average cutter and elite command. And he wrote this little paragraph that I'll read. Perhaps the hope now is those database scouting grades will ensure teams are making a good decision when they fork over the biggest contract yet for a pitcher coming from Japan. We can say with a tiny bit more certainty that he's like a Kevin Gausman with Chris Bassett's curveball and Zach Eflin's command, which would be a dominant combination, but also not necessarily existed in one human being before. This is not just the next hot shot from Japan. By every metric that is available publicly and privately, people think this is potentially like the next big thing, and that is why he's being talked about with the contract he's getting. It's 25 helps, but if he was 27, I don't think we'd be talking crazy differently either.
You're listening to the Mets Pod, presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Subscribe to the Mets Pod at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your shows. And with that, Joe, let's get into the mailbag to continue the offseason talk here. And this first one is from In Stearns We Trust. It's an insane Mets fan on Twitter, but new name. I like the new name. Hashtag In Stearns We Trust. Joe and I are with you. How many years in a contract is too many for Jordan Montgomery? I'd be content with 5, but would understand the apprehension at 6. I think that would be my limit as well here, Joe. I mean, this is a guy that he is 30 years old. So you figure he's going to get a 4 to 5 year deal. He will be pitching this season as a 31-year-old. He turns 31 2 days after Christmas. I think the good thing with Montgomery, when you talk about the length of the deal, is that as a pitcher in this sport, he's aged a little bit like wine, to be honest with you. His last 2 years for the Yankees, he had really turned the corner. Ever since he got traded from the Yankees and pitched for both the Cardinals and the Rangers, he got even better. So I think not a big strikeout guy, but somebody that just constantly can go deep into games. He simply keeps teams off the bases. I think that 5 years would be fine with me, Joe, but I do understand the apprehension about 6 because any arm can break down in their mid-30s.
So we just talked about Yoshinobu Yamamoto and how there'd be no price basically we wouldn't pay. Obviously, there's a line for everything, but reasonably speaking, there's no actual line. Jordan Montgomery, to me, I think he's getting paid at the perfect time in the perfect market. To me, I think his contract is going to be paying for something he's not. He's going to be getting paid like a frontline starter. And I like Jordan Montgomery, the pitcher, in a general sense. I think he's a perfectly fine, like number 3-ish starter that can eat innings. And like you said, Connor, he takes the ball. He works deep in the games. There is value to that.
Yeah.
With that said, I wouldn't go more than 4. And that means I'm not getting Jordan Montgomery. So pragmatic Joe is back. So for me, I think what Jordan Montgomery is going to get, and God bless him, he should get whatever he can get on the market. I probably would cap it at 4. I don't know how. I always get leery. Once you get beyond 34, 35, what is a pitcher going to look like? So I would probably cap it at 4, which to me means I don't think I'll get him because I think he's very much looking at 5, maybe 6. I mean, Eduardo Rodriguez got 4 with a vesting option for a 5th. So I have to imagine Montgomery's looking at 5 guaranteed, maybe a vesting option for a 6. Or if a team really wants him, might have to throw that 6th year out there.
And keep in mind, the problem with Montgomery, much like Yamamoto is, although the options become even, they decrease after Yamamoto signs, the contenders need pitching right now. Mm-hmm. So he's going to be high in demand. And he's so different from Blake Snell. In a sense, Snell's a guy that doesn't work deep into games. Snell's a guy that has the draft pick compensation that, or you get the draft pick deduction if you sign him. There's just a lot there where I think the competitive market is going to get him a 5-year deal. I would guess north of 130 mil.
I think we're looking at closer to $150 million for Montgomery when all is said and done. And a question for you. You usually throw them my way. I'm going to throw in your way. I understand where we are. We're looking at the 2024 season, and that is obviously of importance. We're not trying to punt 2024. We're not trying to give up. Would you rather commit 5 and maybe a vesting option for a 6 to Montgomery, or would you rather go short term and next year you could go all in on a Corbin Burns, you could go all in on a Tyler Glasnow? You're talking about next year's market, a much better market. Would you rather save your money for next year? As Mets fans are right now listening, rolling their eyes at me because they don't care about 2025. Right. But just thinking big picture, would you kind of overpay Jordan Montgomery to have him now versus waiting a year to potentially take those funds plus and get a better pitcher?
It's a fair question, Joe. I look at it that there's a couple ways. The simple answer is you'd rather wait because it feels like it aligns with your timeline a little better. This is a young team. This team's going to be young in a lot of areas. They're going to be trying to answer a lot of questions in those areas to see who's a part of this team in 2025. I think that the Mets are going to be big-time players for Juan Soto's free agency, and I think that is going to really accelerate what this team's competitive window looks like as we talk now compared to what it'll look like next offseason. Not to say that they're just going to take the year off. That's not what we're saying. But I get the thought process of if you don't get Yamamoto, don't make a reactionary move just to make a move. I like Montgomery, the pitcher, a lot. But there is a chance that this market that lacks a lot of free agent pitching does go to a place that starts to defy logic, right? Like you're going to go see a guy like Montgomery. I mean, even the Erod deal was pretty crazy to me. Lugo just got $45 million over 3 years. Like the pitching market kind of starts to develop a life of its own. So I would like to see them pivot to Montgomery, but it goes back to what you said at a cost. I'm not going to 6 years. If I go to 5, that means I got a break on the annual average, and I don't think Montgomery is going to give anyone a break, as he shouldn't on the annual average. So I liked Montgomery a lot when it looked like it could be a 3-year, $90 million deal or 3-year, $80 million deal. I think genuinely, since he got traded to the Rangers and helped guide them to a World Series, which is fair, it evolved to a place, it evolved to double that, right? Like literally, Joe, he looked like a guy that would get, before the trade, I'd say 375. I think that's fair. I really think we could see 6,150 now. I really, really think
very possible. Very possible. I think Jim Bowden projected 6,167 or something like that. So God. The market's hot for Jordan Montgomery, so it's going to be an interesting dichotomy. Just sign Yoshinobu Yamamoto, and we don't have to have this conversation anymore. But until that happens, we're going to have to.
And this goes back to where the Mets are. If the Mets were in a place that they just won 100 games, they have an opening in their rotation, I'd be like, just go get them and pay for your sins later. Like what? If the Mets pod is still on in 2027 or 28, thank God we did something right. And we'll figure out, damn, that's a lot of money on the books for Montgomery. Is it stopping the Mets from doing other moves? But you did it because you think you can win a World Series this year and the next year and then probably the year after that. The Mets right now are not in that scenario where one guy gets you over the hump. Here's a secret for everyone. If the Mets pay Yamamoto $400 million or whatever it is, it has nothing to do with what they think he could do for them this year. It's nice. You might have a rotation that has 2 Japanese aces at the front that get you in the wild card. But the thought process is Yamamoto is your frontline guy for the next 8 years. You know what I mean? So that's the thing. I always think back to, like, I'm a hockey fan with the Rangers, and they've been in a cup window or something like that, and they'll go out and make that move where it's like, okay, you overpaid the guy or you gave him more term than you thought, but it's because we think we can win a Stanley Cup, so who cares? The Mets are not in this window of, we need to go get this one guy and we'll do whatever it takes to get him because it could win us a World Series in the next 2 years. And I think that's the hardest conversation with the Mets, because the counter argument from people, Joe, will be, look at these teams that make the World Series now. They get hot, they make the wild card, they get hot at the right time, but the Mets want to be a sustainable winner. They want to be the East Coast Dodgers and all of that, and that's where it falls into. It's almost like having a little self-control along the way of that, I think, is the way to put it. Let's get another question in here. All right, this is from Almir Lima Jr. Greetings from Brazil. Hello, Almir. All the way from Brazil. Stearns has said that they do not envision upgrading at third base, but at the same time, it would be very risky to just hand the job over to Beatty after his struggles last season. He said, especially with guys like India and Pradas available, getting away from like guys that are just out there. I think I agree that you don't just Mauricio getting hurt, and we kind of opened the show with this, but to go a little deeper on it, it's not just, all right, Brett Beatty, you have a year to show what you got. I don't think the Mets will be that, out of touch with reality. That's something like, would the Pirates do that? Would a team, right? The Mets, I don't think, can afford to just say, we're going to give this kid could bat 180 for 3 months, but he's got the full year. And I think that goes back to your point, Joe, about a guy like Justin Turner, that you're not trading him. And it's like, okay, Turner's here for 6 years. He's here for the year, and you can put more on his plate as you go if Beatty can't handle what was asked of him.
First off, thank you for listening from Brazil. It's crazy to think. I assume we're just in a tri-state little bubble that just all the Mets fans in tri-state area listen, but really appreciate it.
Big listenership in the UK. Fun fact.
Yes, that is true. That is true. We were once the #1 baseball podcast in the UK, so that was cool to see.
Amazing. It's amazing.
But when you think about third base, David Stearns has said it, and I fully agree with him. He said, when you think about young players, you need to give them a chance to play. I understand that patience level in New York by New York fans is not the same as Milwaukee, as mid-market, small market places. And to your point, I totally agree. Like, if Brett Beatty's hitting 180 with 3 home runs in June, he shouldn't be playing third base, right? Like there's obviously a line of demarcation here. At the same time, if you don't give young players opportunity, you will never know what a young player is, because very few of them come up and dominate from jump and become those are special superstar players that come up and dominate from day one and they never look back. Most young players have an adjustment period. The major leagues, ready? Really hard. Major League Baseball, not easy. So Brett Baty obviously had a very rough 2023 in his first full season. There's no way around it. He didn't hit. He didn't really field. He now has an opportunity to redeem himself. He's a hard worker. I see the videos on his Instagram of everything he's putting in to get better for the 2024 season. If this doesn't light a fire under Brett Baty, the Ronny Mauricio injury, which basically, I don't want to say hands him the third base job, but certainly makes him the favorite to get that opportunity on opening day. If this doesn't light a fire under you to take that next step, then nothing will. So I agree generally that third base can't be his all year, no matter what. But at the same time, you have to let these young guys play, get a chance. It'll be the same conversation when Drew Gilbert comes up, when Luis Angel Acuna comes up, Jet Williams, you name all the prospects in the system. When they come up, you have to eventually give them runway to adjust at the major league level.
All right, our last question from today's show is from @top_S21. Do you think we will ever see another deal like Ohtani's? Now, Joe, obviously the thought with Ohtani being able to pitch again from the Dodgers played into the max value of the contract. In fact, he's getting $700 million. Insane when you think of nobody had cleared $500 million in the sport before. I think obviously Soto could get $600 million next offseason. I really, really do. Now, the structure of the deal, Joe, I don't think we'll ever see this again. I don't think any player would be interested in deferring 68 of the $70 million per year, going by the percentage of it. No, I think this was a one-of-one, a guy that I think is obsessed with getting the losing stink off of him. He wants to win multiple World Series and go down as the greatest player to ever play the sport. And I think with the endorsement opportunities he has, obviously being a global icon in terms of what he's able to do from endorsements there, also was a unique standpoint in this.
As a pro wrestling fan, you never say never. But with that said, very hard to believe everything with Ohtani will ever happen again. I think as time goes on, I'm sure we'll have another $700 million player at some point. Like you said, Juan Soto might be 600 next year. I would say certainly above 500. The key, and I'm sure that was probably the premise of the question, was not just, is there another $700 million player in the future?
Of course there is.
Is there another $700 million player who will defer, like you said, 68 of the 70 per year? That I find hard to believe. And we talked about it earlier in the show. Maybe in the next collective bargaining agreement, there's some kind of cap. You could only defer up to blank % of any contract. So I think this is a one-of-one. Ohtani is a one-of-one. His free agency whole thing was a one-of-one. I think everything related to him should be put in like a time capsule and be saved for all of time, because everything surrounding Shohei Ohtani is unique and no one else could get into that capsule.
This is the Mets Pod presented by Tri-State Cadillac. Elevate your style in a Cadillac. Go from bold to bolder in an SUV, from inspiring to awe-inspiring in a sedan. Visit your Tri-State Cadillac dealer today. And remember to subscribe to the show at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SNY's YouTube channel, or wherever you get your podcasts. Big week ahead. Could feel it in my bones, Joe. The moves are going to happen. We'll see if we get an emergency podcast. But with that, we'll be with you guys for the rest of the offseason here on the Mets Pod. Thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you next week.